If you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks. When you grow up in a small town, you tend to notice the little things, the details that may seem insignificant to outsiders, but carry deep meaning for those who live at the heart of that town. Every movement, every whisper in the wind, becomes part of the larger story of daily life. In my small village, people were isolated on the surface, but they knew almost everything about each other. There were no secrets that could be hidden for long. Everyone knew what was going on in each other's lives, even if they did not talk about it directly. It was as if the streets and trees themselves passed along the news. The street where we lived was always quiet, surrounded by rows of old houses, their walls filled with the scent of the past, and shaded by tall trees that whispered in the wind whenever a soft breeze passed by. Those trees had witnessed generations come and go, some remaining while others disappeared. Yet they remained silent, like faithful guardians of history. We lived in a small house, surrounded by an old white wooden fence. My house felt like a natural part of this place, surrounded by childhood memories and scattered laughter. But the house across the street, the one belonging to our neighbor, Mr. Collins, was completely different. It seemed strange, not just because of its larger size or modern design compared to the other houses, but also because of its odd aura. The house was always spotless, gleaming as if it had not aged. It was always clean, as if it had never known dust or dirt. Everything in it seemed deliberately placed to appear perfect, without a single flaw. Mr. Collins, the owner of the house, was a wealthy, eccentric man. He did not talk much and preferred solitude. Even when we passed by him in the street, he barely noticed our presence. If he did, he might nod his head in greeting, but there was no real conversation or connection. He lived with his wife, Mrs. Collins, and their 2-year-old daughter, Stacy. That little girl was like a beam of joy in that strange house. What caught my attention most about Mr. Collins, aside from his odd silence, was his obsession with his car. He owned a sleek black sports car, the kind you only see in luxury magazines. The car seemed like it belonged to another world, one far removed from ours. Every weekend, without fail, he would spend hours in the garage polishing and cleaning it meticulously, as if it were made of gold. He would take care of every inch of the car, ensuring that every part of it was shiny and flawless. Sometimes I would watch him from my bedroom window, wondering about his deep attachment to the car. I often asked myself, why would a car be so important to someone? I could not understand how a person could spend so much time caring for an inanimate object. It seemed as if the car held a deeper meaning for him, something beyond being just a mode of transportation. Perhaps it represented something that I could not comprehend, and maybe this obsession concealed something more profound. In contrast to her husband, Mrs. Collins was always kind and friendly. Whenever she passed by our house, she would wave at me with a bright smile, making me feel like there was real warmth in that family, despite the mystery surrounding her husband. Sometimes she would stop to chat with me, asking me about school or my day, and on other occasions, she would offer me some of the freshly baked cookies she made herself. She radiated kindness and warmth, and seemed like the most natural person in our quiet neighborhood. Their little daughter, Stacy, was always cheerful and happy. I would see her running and playing in their front yard, filling the air with her loud laughter and playful shouts. She would play tirelessly, bringing a touch of life to our otherwise quiet neighborhood. Seeing her with her mother was always comforting, as if they represented that rare familial warmth we often miss in other parts of our lives. But as happens sometimes in life, things do not always stay the same. One day, everything changed. Mrs. Collins and Stacy suddenly disappeared, as if they had vanished into thin air. There was no explanation. I remember that day vividly, when the police came to our door and asked us if we had seen Mrs. Collins or Stacy. They said Mr. Collins had reported them missing, claiming that his wife had taken their daughter and run away. It was shocking for all of us, especially for my parents. There was not much we could say to the police, because we had simply not seen anything unusual. Like the rest of the people in the village, we believed that Mrs. Collins had left on her own, perhaps because of some family issues we were unaware of. Weeks passed, then months, and there was no trace of them. The town was buzzing with rumors. Everyone had their own story about what happened. Some said Mrs. Collins had run off with another man, while others whispered darker and more terrifying theories. I tried my best to push those thoughts out of my head, but a strange feeling kept creeping back. Every time I saw Mr. Collins polishing his car, I felt a chill run down my spine. It seemed to me as if he were trying to escape from something, as if the car was his way of distancing himself from the truth. That feeling lingered with me in a way I could not explain. A few months after Mrs. Collins and Stacy disappeared, something very strange happened. My father was working in the garage, fixing his old truck, when he noticed something odd in Mr. Collins's garage. The garage door was slightly open, and he could barely see Mrs. Collins's white Jeep inside, covered in a thick layer of dust, as if it had not moved in months. My father called my mother and me to come see what he had discovered, and we stood there in shock. If Mrs. Collins had run away, why had she left her car behind? It was a clear sign that something was not right. A few days later, we noticed that the Jeep had disappeared. It was no longer in the garage. We assumed that Mr. Collins had sold it or gotten rid of it, but he said nothing to anyone. His behavior became more bizarre day by day. He started avoiding leaving the house, and when he did, he seemed nervous and anxious. He constantly looked over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to be watching him. Even his black car, which he had once cared for so diligently, became neglected, covered in a layer of dirt. Then one night, while we were having dinner together, we heard a loud noise coming from Mr. Collins's house. My father immediately got up, grabbed a flashlight, and told us to stay inside. We watched from the window as he walked toward Mr. Collins' house. He knocked on the door and waited for a long time before Mr. Collins finally opened it. When he did, he looked pale and sickly. My father asked if everything was all right, and Mr. Collins gave a brief answer, saying that he had fallen. But there was something strange about the situation. When my father came back inside, he seemed disturbed. He told us that when Mr. Collins opened the door, he saw in the dim light a pot of some kind of liquid boiling on the stove, and next to it, a gun on the kitchen table. My father could not explain what he saw, but he felt that something was very wrong. I had been delivering food for a few months, driving around the city, getting to know every corner as if I were part of its pulse. Most nights were routine, picking up orders, following the GPS, dropping them off, and moving on to the next. It was all very repetitive, predictable even, until that night when everything changed. It was a little after midnight when I received an order from a part of town I had never been to before. The GPS led me to an unfamiliar place, and with each passing moment, the sense of unease grew. The houses in that area were spaced far apart, and the streets twisted and turned in ways that didn't make sense. Like I had driven into some kind of dark maze where every corner brought more confusion. Streetlights were few and far between, casting long, eerie shadows that danced across the road. The further I drove, the more I felt that something was off. The streets didn't match the map on my phone, and I found myself turning around again and again, as if the roads had shifted without warning. My grip on the steering wheel tightened as that pit of anxiety in my stomach grew, but I knew I had to make the delivery. Finally, after what felt like hours, the GPS announced that I had arrived. I slowed down and looked at the house. It stood at the end of a dead-end street, a narrow, tall building with peeling paint and broken windows. The grass around it was overgrown, reaching up to my knees, and there was no sign of life. The house looked abandoned. For a moment, I hesitated, my hand moving to shift the car into reverse, ready to back out of there. But then I thought about the order. The customer waiting for their food. Maybe the house was just old, and someone still lived there. Maybe they were too tired or busy to fix it up. I tried to shake off the discomfort that clung to me like a cold fog, grabbed the bag of food, and stepped out of the car. The air was thick and heavy, almost suffocating as I walked toward the house. The gravel crunched beneath my feet, the only sound in the silent night. The closer I got, the stronger the feeling that someone was watching me grew. A shiver ran down my spine as I reached the porch, noticing that the front door was slightly ajar. It creaked open with the slightest push, revealing a dark hallway stretching into nothingness. I could barely see a few feet inside before the darkness swallowed everything beyond. I called out, my voice shaky. "Hello?" There was no answer, only the echo of my voice bouncing back from the empty hallway. Something deep inside me screamed to leave the food and run back to the car, but instead I took another step forward, peering into the darkness. That's when I heard it. A faint rustling sound, like leaves being dragged across the ground. I turned to look at the street, and there I saw them. Figures emerging from the shadows, slipping silently between houses and around corners as if gliding across the ground. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat thundering in my ears as they approached. The first one stepped into the dim porch light, and I saw it clearly. It was a person, but their face was hidden behind a white, featureless mask. The mask had no expression, just smooth, cold porcelain. The others followed, all wearing the same eerie blank masks. They surrounded me, closing in from all sides. I tried to back away, but I was trapped against the porch railing. My breath came in quick, shallow gasps, and my mind raced, searching for a way out. One of them reached out a hand, and in my panic, I dropped the bag of food to the ground. Their hands were cold as ice as they grabbed me, pulling me toward the house. I struggled, trying to break free, but they were too strong. The more I resisted, the tighter their grip became. They didn't say a word, didn't make a sound as they dragged me inside, and the door slammed shut behind us, plunging me into darkness. I was blind, but my other senses took over. I could hear their footsteps around me, soft but purposeful. I felt their cold hands on me, searching my pockets, taking my wallet, my phone, my keys. I wanted to scream for help, but the sound died in my throat. It was as if the darkness itself had swallowed my voice. My mind was spinning, trying to comprehend what was happening, but nothing made sense. All I felt was pure terror, an overwhelming fear as they stripped me of everything. Finally, they let go, and I collapsed to the ground, shaking. I heard their footsteps fading away, the door opening and closing once more, and then they were gone, leaving me alone in the dark house. I stayed there for what felt like hours, too scared to move, my mind replaying the events over and over, trying to make sense of them. But there was no sense to be found. I had stepped into another world, a place where the rules didn't apply, where nothing made sense. Eventually, I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling beneath me. I found the door unlocked, pushed it open, and stumbled out into the night. The street was empty. No sign of the masked figures, no sign of anyone. My car was still there, untouched, as if nothing had happened. But I knew that I had lost more than just my belongings. I had lost my sense of safety, my trust in the world around me. I drove away from that house as fast as I could, the streets still twisting and turning, leading me in circles until I finally found my way back to the main road. I didn't look back. I kept driving, trying to escape the memory of those blank masks, those cold hands that had pulled me into the darkness. But I knew, deep down, that I would never truly escape. The fear would always be there, lurking just out of sight, waiting to pull me back into that endless, twisting nightmare. The hospital was quiet at night, almost eerily quiet. I wasn't at my best, and my shift seemed to stretch on forever. The endless white walls, the hum of the dim fluorescent lights, and the distant sounds of machines made the place feel strange as the sun set. The office on the lower floor was my only true refuge, a small room with dim lighting where I spent most of my nights when things were slow. It was the place I went to gather my thoughts. The office was close to the morgue, which made me try to avoid thinking about it as much as possible. The time was around midnight, maybe a little after, and I was sitting in the office with one of the organizers. We weren't doing much. We just passed the time with empty chatter and exchanged glances at the clock. We were waiting for our shift to end, and the air was thick with the smell of disinfectant, the kind that clings to your clothes and fills your lungs. The only sounds were the hum of the dim lights in the ceiling and the distant roar of the air conditioning. Suddenly I heard footsteps in the hallway. They were slow and deliberate, not like the hurried steps of a doctor or nurse. The sound caught our attention, and we turned to look at the open entrance. A man was passing by, and his eyes glinted in our direction as he walked. There was something odd about the way he looked at us, something unsettling and eerie. He didn't say a word and continued walking, but I felt a strange shiver run down my spine. A few moments later, the man returned this time. He stopped at the entrance and stared at us. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes were wide as if he hadn't slept in days. His clothes were neat but old-fashioned, as if he had stepped out of an old film. He didn't seem like he belonged in this place, out of place in the modern, sterile hospital. "Do you have access to the morgue?" he asked in a low, gravelly voice. I exchanged a glance with the other organizer, We assumed he was on some sort of delivery mission for a funeral home. It wasn't entirely unusual, although the late hour made it strange. "Yes," I said cautiously, wondering what he was doing here so late. The man's expression didn't change, but there was a glimmer in his eyes that made me feel uneasy. I couldn't pinpoint why, but something about him felt wrong. I expected him to mention a name or provide some sort of explanation, but he didn't. Instead, he just stood there, staring at us with that disturbing look. Then he said something that made my heart race. "I'll pay you for it. Let me in for just an hour. I need to be alone with the bodies." The words hung in the air like a foul odor, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The other man and I exchanged another glance. This glance was filled with disbelief and anxiety. The man didn't seem to notice our discomfort. His gaze was fixed, almost desperate, as if he was waiting for us to say, "Yes." I could feel the tension in the room. It was thick and suffocating in my mind, and my thoughts raced as I tried to process what he was asking. Who would want to stay alone in the morgue at this time of night? And why was the whole situation wrong? Like a nightmare come to life, we couldn't do it. "It's against hospital policy," I said, my voice sounding more confident than I felt. The man's expression darkened, and for a moment, I thought he might argue or try to convince us. But then it seemed he realized we wouldn't budge. His eyes narrowed, and his jaw tightened. The muscles in his face twitched slightly. He didn't say anything, just stared at us with a look that made my skin crawl. Finally, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the hallway. The other man and I sat there in stunned silence. The weight of what had just happened slowly sank into my heart, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we had avoided something terrible. "We should tell security," I said after a moment. The other guard nodded, and we hurried up to the security office. The hospital felt more dangerous as we walked through the empty halls, where the shadows seemed to stretch and grow in the dim light. When we reached the security office, we found the guard on duty and explained what had happened as we described the man. The guard's expression changed. He leaned forward, squinting his eyes as if trying to recognize him. "Did he say anything about wanting to be alone in the morgue?" the guard asked in a tense voice. "Yes," I replied, my stomach tightening as the guard's anxiety grew. He let out a heavy sigh and shook his head. "He's done this before. We've had some trouble with him over the past 2 months. He always disappears before we can catch him, but we know he's planning something," the guard said. "That man isn't new to this place." What could he want with the bodies in the morgue? My mind conjured all kinds of disturbing possibilities, none of them comforting. The guard assured us that they would increase patrols and keep an eye on the man, but the whole experience left me trembling. As I made my way back to the office downstairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had come dangerously close to something dark and complicated. The hospital no longer felt safe, not like it ever truly had. But it was different now. It felt like a place where shadows concealed horrific secrets that were unimaginable for the rest of my shift. I couldn't stop thinking about the man. His pale face, his desperate eyes, and the way he asked to be left alone with the dead. All of it replayed in my mind over and over again like a broken record. Even after my shift ended and I returned home, the anxiety lingered like a shadow that refused to leave. I never saw the man again, but the memory of that night stayed with me every time I passed the morgue. I felt the same chill, the one that reminded me of how close we had come to allowing something monstrous to slip through our fingers. In 2019, when I was 13 years old, my father took me on a hunting trip to the Pine Barrens we had visited before. But this time, things were completely different. When we arrived, the atmosphere was darker, and the trees seemed to be closer together than before, as if they were trying to trap us. The air was thick, filled with the scent of damp leaves and pine needles. The silence was so profound that the wind barely made a sound. We arrived just before sunset, near the edge of the forest. My father always told me that the best time to hunt was at night when the animals were more active. I didn't feel scared. I had been hunting with him before, and I trusted him. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the darkness swallowed the trees, I began to feel uneasy. The shadows stretched longer, turning the forest into a maze of dark shapes. We walked deeper into the woods, our footsteps making soft sounds on the fallen leaves, while my father carried his rifle and I held a smaller one. He had gifted it to me on my birthday, and I clutched it close to my chest, feeling the cold metal against my palm. The further we went, the denser the trees became, blocking the moonlight, and soon the only light we had came from our flashlights, which flickered intermittently. We paused frequently, listening for any signs of movement. My father was good at tracking animals and often bent down to inspect the ground, but that night we heard or saw nothing. No rustling leaves, no snapping branches. It was as if the forest had vanished completely. After an hour of walking, I started to feel tired. My legs ached, and I wanted to rest. My father noticed and suggested we sit for a while. We found a small clearing and sat on a fallen tree trunk. The forest was so quiet that I could hear my heart beat. My father whispered something about waiting for the right moment, but I barely heard him. I was focused so much on the darkness around us. Suddenly there was a sound, unlike the usual rustling of leaves or the breaking of a branch. It was a low, deep, guttural growl, as if something large was watching us. My heart raced, and I looked at my father, who was staring straight ahead. His face was pale, and he slowly reached for his rifle, signaling me to do the same. The growl came again, this time closer, reverberating through the trees and creating an eerie feeling in my stomach. My neck hairs stood on end as I gripped my rifle tightly, my hands trembling. My father stood slowly, his eyes scanning the trees. He didn't say a word, but I could see fear in his eyes. Whatever was out there was unlike anything we had ever faced before. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall, much taller than any animal I had ever seen. I had seen something like it before. It had a hunched body and glowing eyes that pierced through the darkness. It resembled a wolf, but was much larger, as if it didn't belong to this world. Its growl intensified, becoming more aggressive. The creature's breath was visible in the cold night air, and I could see its sharp teeth gleaming in the faint light of our flashlights. My father whispered for me to stay still, but my legs felt like they were about to give way. I remained frozen in place as the creature approached slowly, its growl turning into a snarl, its yellow eyes locked onto us. My father raised his rifle, aiming it at the creature, but he didn't pull the trigger. It was as if we both knew that firing wouldn't save us. The creature circled us, moving through the shadows. Every time I thought it had disappeared, it would reappear. its glowing eyes watching us from the darkness. I could hardly breathe from sheer terror. We were trapped, surrounded by darkness and this terrifying creature. It let out a high, chilling howl that seemed to shake the trees around us. My father grabbed my arm and pulled me to my feet without thinking. I ran. I heard my father sprinting behind me, and the creature's growls echoed through the forest. The trees blurred as we dashed through the underbrush, scratching my arms and burning my face. I felt like my legs would collapse, but I didn't stop. We ran deeper into the forest, oblivious to the direction we were heading. All I knew was that I had to get away from that creature. But the more we ran, the more lost we became. The familiar paths disappeared, and every direction looked the same, endless and dark. After what felt like hours, we stopped to catch our breath. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my legs were trembling from exhaustion as my father leaned against a tree. His face was pale and sweaty, and while the growling had ceased, the silence that followed was even more terrifying. "We need to keep moving," my father said in a barely audible whisper, but I didn't know where to go. We had lost our way in the pine forest, and that creature was still out there watching us. We wandered through the woods for what seemed like hours, trying to find our way back to the truck. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow looked like the creature. My flashlight beam began to dim, growing weaker, and the thought of being stuck in the pitch-black forest terrified me. I thought we might never find our way out. Suddenly, I stumbled upon a familiar path, narrow and overgrown, but I recognized it. My father sighed in relief, and we followed the path back to the truck. When we finally reached it, I felt a heavy weight lift off my shoulders. I climbed into the passenger seat, my hands still shaking, and then my father started the engine, and we drove away from the dark trees of the pine forest that faded into the distance. We didn't talk during the drive home. Our encounter with that creature was something neither of us could explain, and I didn't want to think about it anymore. But as I gazed out the window, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't been alone in that forest that night. However, I knew one thing for sure. I would never go hunting in the pine forest again. I have been working the night shift at this gas station for almost a year now. The place is on the edge of town, far enough away that we don't get a lot of traffic during the late night hours. It's a quiet job. Most of the time, I sit behind the counter, occasionally talking to a customer, while watching the clock crawl slowly toward morning or night. That night wasn't any different. It was around 2:30 a.m., and I was getting ready to end my shift. The store was empty, as usual at this time, with the outside lights casting long shadows across the parking lot, and the only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning inside the store. I was counting the cash from the register, making sure everything was in order. My manager had always told me to be careful, especially at night. "You never know who might come through that door," she would say. I thought I had everything under control. Then, suddenly, the front door swung open, and the sound was deafening. I almost jumped out of my seat before I could even comprehend what was happening. A man burst in, looking rough, wearing dirty clothes with wild eyes, and he smelled like he hadn't bathed in days. He didn't say anything, but his eyes were locked onto the cash I was holding in my hand. My body froze for a second, and everything seemed to slow down. I knew I had to do something, but I just stood there in shock. In a flash, He lunged at me and grabbed the cash from my hand. Everything happened so quickly. 1 second the money was in my hand, and the next it was gone, and the man was already halfway to the door. That's when my instincts finally kicked in. I don't know what happened to me, but I wasn't going to let him get away. I bolted from behind the counter and ran after him, yelling at him to stop, adrenaline pumping through my veins, overcoming any fear I might have felt about how fast the man was moving. He stumbled as he reached the parking lot, his movements unsteady. I imagined he was on drugs, maybe even saw the cash spilling from his jacket pocket as he tried to flee. He turned around, panic in his eyes. He tried to run faster, but his body wasn't cooperating. I closed the gap between us without thinking. I grabbed his arm. He struggled to break free, but I held on. We grappled for a moment before he shook me off and started running again, but he wasn't getting far. My heart was racing, but I wasn't about to give up. I searched for my phone and called 911, my hands trembling as I explained the situation to the operator. I told them where I was, described the man, and what had just happened. They informed me that officers were on their way. I continued to follow him, keeping a safe distance. Now, I didn't want to corner him. Who knows what a desperate man might do? He didn't seem to notice that I was still on his tail. He was focused on running, though it was clear he was getting tired. He wasn't going to get far. His steps were slowing, and he kept glancing over his shoulder after what felt like hours, though it was probably just a few minutes. Suddenly, I heard the distant sound of police sirens. The man heard the sound too. He stopped in his tracks. His whole body tensed up, and I stayed back, not wanting to scare him more. In moments, police cars rolled into the lot, their lights flashing. 2 officers jumped out, guns drawn, ordering the man to lie on the ground. He hesitated for a moment, but he knew it was over. Slowly, he knelt down and placed his hands behind his head. The officers moved in, cuffed him, and pulled him to his feet. One officer approached me and asked for the details. I explained everything, still trying to catch my breath. My hands were shaking, but I did my best to stay calm as I recounted what had happened. They searched the man and found the cash still stuffed in his jacket. One officer told me the man was homeless and likely on drugs, which explained his erratic behavior. He was probably desperate for anything he could get his hands on. I watched as they led him to the back of a police car. His head hung low, and part of me felt sorry for him. Living on the streets, addicted to something that was destroying his life. But at the same time, I felt relieved that the whole ordeal was over. The officers thanked me for my quick response and told me I did the right thing by calling them. They said chasing him down wasn't the safest choice, but they understood why I did it. I nodded, still shaking from the whole experience after the police left. I went back inside the gas station, feeling that the place was different now. That quiet night that had once been just another work night had turned into something I wouldn't forget anytime soon. I sat behind the counter, trying to calm my nerves, my hands still trembling. I looked at the clock. My shift was almost over, but I wasn't counting down the minutes as I usually did. I just sat there, staring at the front door. It was normal to expect someone else to come in to take over for the rest of the night. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had brushed against something much worse when my shift finally ended. I grabbed my things and left the door closed behind me as I walked to my car. I couldn't help but think about that man. Life had beaten him down, and in his desperation, he made a choice that landed him in the back of a police car. But as I drove home, I realized something I was fortunate for. Things could have gone so much worse that night. The road stretched out before us, dark and winding as we drove through the forest. The atmosphere was perfect for a fun-filled weekend, as I was with my friends Devin, Bethany, and Seth on a camping trip. We all needed a break after a tough semester in college. The idea of sleeping under the stars, roasting marshmallows, and telling ghost stories by the fire had us all excited. However, there was something different about that night. The trees seemed closer to the road, their branches reaching out like twisted fingers. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy above, casting strange shadows that danced across the pavement. I tried to shake off the anxiety that settled deep in my stomach, convincing myself that it was just the thrill of the trip. We were laughing, the radio playing our favorite songs, and then suddenly, a sharp turn appeared out of nowhere. Devin, who was driving, tried to swerve, but the car skidded on the wet road. The world spun around us as the tires squealed, and the car veered off the road and crashed into the trees. I heard Bethany scream, and then everything went black. When I opened my eyes, we were all standing outside the car. It was crumpled against a tree, the front smashed in, with steam rising from the engine. I felt strange, as if everything was muffled and distant. Bethany stood beside me, her face pale, and Seth was on the other side, staring at the wreckage. I wondered to myself, "Is everyone okay?" I asked in a voice that sounded strangely flat. Bethany slowly nodded, but she wouldn't look at me. Seth was silent, his eyes fixed on the car. I turned to see what he was staring at, and then my heart dropped. We were still strapped into our seats, our bodies trembling, unable to process what we were seeing. I was leaning against the passenger seat, and I saw a drop of blood trickle down. Devin was still gripping the steering wheel, his forehead bleeding, his face contorted in pain. Bethany and Seth were in the back, their faces flushed. Bethany whispered, and finally she looked at me. Her eyes were wide with fear, but we were still there. I didn't know what to think. It felt like a nightmare, yet everything was so clear, so painfully real. I reached out to touch the car, but my hand went straight through the metal. The road stretched out before us, dark and winding as we drove through the forest. The atmosphere was perfect for a fun-filled weekend, as I was with my friends Devin, Bethany, and Seth on a camping trip. We all needed a break after a tough semester in college. The idea of sleeping under the stars, roasting marshmallows, and telling ghost stories by the fire had us all excited. However, there was something different about that night. The trees seemed closer to the road, their branches reaching out like twisted fingers. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy above, casting strange shadows that danced across the pavement. I tried to shake off the anxiety that settled deep in my stomach, convincing myself that it was just the thrill of the trip. We were laughing, the radio playing our favorite songs, and then suddenly, a sharp turn appeared out of nowhere. Devin, who was driving, tried to swerve, but the car skidded on the wet road. The world spun around us as the tires squealed, and the car veered off the road and crashed into the trees. I heard Bethany scream, and then everything went black. When I opened my eyes, we were all standing outside the car. It was crumpled against a tree, the front smashed in, with steam rising from the engine. I felt strange, as if everything was muffled and distant. Bethany stood beside me, her face pale, and Seth was on the other side, staring at the wreckage. I wondered to myself, is everyone okay? I asked in a voice that sounded strangely flat. Bethany slowly nodded, but she wouldn't look at me. Seth was silent, his eyes fixed on the car. I turned to see what he was staring at, and then my heart dropped. We were still strapped into our seats, our bodies trembling, unable to process what we were seeing. I was leaning against the passenger seat, and I saw a drop of blood trickle down. Devin was still gripping the steering wheel, his forehead bleeding, his face contorted in pain. Bethany and Seth were in the back, their faces flushed. Bethany whispered, and finally she looked at me. Her eyes were wide with fear, but we were still there. I didn't know what to think. It felt like a nightmare, yet everything was so clear, so painfully real. I reached out to touch the car, but my hand went straight through the metal.